Greetings all, and welcome to part 2 of the KP Models 1/72nd scale Mig-15. In today's video, we're going to have a look at painting this aircraft as it appears at the Queensland Air Museum as number 636 from the Polish Air Force. So, without further ado, let's get into it. Our Mig-15 at the Queensland Air Museum's been done up in the pretty standard for an Eastern Bloc scheme of bare aluminium. Although our aircraft is quite dull, I decided instead to go based on some other reference photos which show the aircraft in a much more shiny finish overall, but also with a lot of mismatching panels. I decided to go with this since there were a lot more photos both of restored MiGs and of a couple of the older MiGs in this style. It was also a little bit more of a challenge to do and something I wanted to try, and it also had a lot more character. I also decided to experiment with using the Tamiya aerosols to achieve the bare aluminium finish. To do this, I started by backing the entire aircraft with a coat of X1 Tamiya gloss black. This was to create a nice smooth and also shiny backing, which would hopefully help the bare aluminium pop a little bit more and have a nice finish. I applied it using my regular technique of thinning the paint with a little bit of water and then applying it with the brush in the direction air would flow over the aircraft, so either from nose to tail or vice versa. This was to help reduce brush strokes and create the nice smooth backing for the paint. I then used a bit of blue tack to seal up the interior of the cockpit so it would not get sprayed, and after giving the model a little wipe with some water and a tissue, I was ready to apply the aerosol. Starting with the top surface of the aircraft, I gave my can of AS12 bare metal silver a little shake, before then doing several passes over the model using a very light pressure on the trigger to help spray it very gently over the model. I made sure to build it up in thin layers, much as I would with hand painting, and while it was drying I repeated this process on the underside. I repeated this process of spraying over the model about 2 or 3 times on both the under and upper surface, and with that I had a very lovely metallic and shiny finish on my Mig-15 that I was very happy with. Moving on to attempting to create some of the mismatching panels, I decided to try and use the Vallejo silver, which is a much more bright and vibrant colour, and a little bit of XF16 flat aluminium, which is a much more dull silver, to try and create a little bit of variety by painting some of the various panels. The result ended up being a little bit more subtle than I'd liked, but it was still noticeable if you looked closely. The interior wells of the landing gear appear to be a dark grey based on our restored aircraft, so I used XF24, the same colour I used in the cockpit, to paint the interior of the landing gear bay in my MiG. I painted the struts for the landing gear a bit of Vallejo silver for some of them, and for the painted parts RLM grey. The tyres then received 2 coats of Vallejo flat black, and I painted Vallejo vermilion red on the small symbol that's in the centre of the air intake of our MiG. As a further experiment to try and create more variety in the shininess of the metal panels, I decided to brush paint some of the Vallejo gloss varnish, semi-gloss and flat varnish on the various panels to create a bit of variety. These are water-based gloss varnishes which you can thin down with a little bit of water and apply using a brush. Although I'm sure this technique is frowned upon by many modelers, since I was wanting to do a lot of different patchy areas, it worked out quite nicely. I'd simply apply it as if it was a little bit of paint that I wanted to keep nice and thin by mixing it with water and then applying it onto the panels. I used the gloss primarily on the front of the aircraft, on the speed brake, on some of the front sections of the tail, and on the wings, while semi-gloss, or as Vallejo call it in their range, satin gloss, was used on the control surfaces, the areas in front of the cockpit on the nose, some of the access hatches on both the sides of the aircraft and the underside, the exhaust, and some of the larger sections of the tail. I based which sections I painted gloss and semi-gloss on mainly the reference photos, since there seemed to be a lot of commonality with sections being either flat or more of a glossy finish. I also forgot to mention that I painted the rear section of the engine area and also the fuel tanks in semi-gloss as well. The result is pretty subtle, especially by looking at this video, but it's definitely noticeable when you look at the aircraft in real life, and I can't say I noticed any ill effects of hand painting on the varnish. Although obviously it's probably quicker to airbrush it, it was a little bit easier in this case since I wanted the mismatching panels to hand paint it. Once the varnishing was all completed and dried, I then painted the hubs for both the nose and the main landing gear Vallejo 70970 deep green, before going over the tyres with some flat black to neaten up any mistakes, and then applying a bit of flat black in the exhaust. Moving on to the decals, as I mentioned in the introduction, they'd weathered pretty badly over the years. In fairness, it had been around about 50, so I wasn't too surprised that they were yellowed. Fortunately, I had some spares, but unfortunately they were Mr. Craft decals, which pretty much split as soon as they're applied in water. But I persevered and applied the decals carefully, and although there are a few cracks on some of them, it sort of just added to the weathered appearance that I was going for, so it was okay. For the 363 markings, I used some spare decals from the Revell P60, or the Night Fighter version of the A20 Havoc basically, and after cutting out the numbers I needed, I carefully slid them into position, moved them around a little bit with the tweezers, and once I was happy with the position of all the decals, I gave them a coat of Tamiya decal adhesive to help them adhere to the model. I painted the edges of the canopy frame its outside colour, which was the Vallejo silver, and after giving it a little bit of a clean up by scratching off the excess paint with a cocktail stick just after it had dried, and with that it was time to move on to the weathering, which is what we'll be covering in the next video. So thanks a lot for having a watch of this one. I do hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, please be sure to leave a like, and if you have any suggestions or questions, leave them down in the comment section below. Thanks again, and hope to see you on the finale for this build, and until then, model on!